Hello everyone, it's Tom Slater here, editor of Spiked. We'll get into this typically brilliant episode of Last Orders in just one moment, but before we do that, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's bought a copy of Brendan O'Neill's brilliant book, A Heretic's Manifesto. Thank you for buying it. Thank you for leaving glowing reviews on Amazon. It's been great to read your emails, letting us know what you think about it as well. The media response has been great too. It's been highly praised by everyone from Michael Schellenberger to Julia Hartley-Brewer to Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia. So if you haven't got your copy of A Heretic's Manifesto yet, what are you waiting for? Stop everything you're doing right now. Go to Amazon UK or Amazon US and order yourself a copy. Just make sure you come back here straight after and listen to this podcast. Thanks so much. And now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast all about freedom and the nanny-state. In this episode, we discuss the grand folly of net zero, the unholy alliance between Tony Blair and Jamie Oliver, and why the nanny-state lobby is furious with Barbie. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm all right here again, the proverbial bad smell.
Put that on a t-shirt for you. And we're delighted to be joined in this episode by Ralph Schoellhammer. He's assistant professor in economics and political science at Webster University Vienna and a Spike contributor. Ralph, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Ralph, we're going to start with you to talk about a topic that you've just written a brilliant long read for us on, which is something that we talk a fair bit about on this show and on Spikes, but I think you really cast a very interesting light on it, which is net zero, this policy that much of the Western world is careening towards headlong, this desire to decarbonize energy. And yet, what you really lay out in really stark detail, I think, is the profound costs that come with net zero, particularly not just for the poorest in society, but for the poorest the world over, really. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your main thesis there? Why isn't this kind of headlong dash towards net zero such a problem for the world's least well off, would you say?
Well, I think the kind of the main thing to say, and which kind of very often I believe starts and ends the debate, is that there is not a single society on the planet that has low energy and a high degree of wealth. These two things are intrinsically connected. And we tend to forget this. I mean, this was also a point I tried to make in the piece. We tend to forget where everything comes from. And this is, I think, one of the biggest problems in our modern society. We just assume, you turn the light switch and the light goes on. You have indoor plumbing. You go outside and there is a street. There is you live, let's say, in an apartment building on the 12th floor and there is an elevator. I think we have completely mislearned or unlearned. I think that's the right. We have unlearned kind of where all of these things come from. There is this idea that we can switch to something almost mythical, these kind of new forms of energy and maintain these luxuries in many ways. I mean, in the comparison to the broader picture of human history, we live in an unprecedented time of luxury, which I think is a good thing. And I think and I'm sure we're going to talk about this as well. And to be honest, I think this really drives at least parts of the modern environmental movement, right? That we live in this unprecedented time of luxury, so it must be sinful. This is almost a quasi-religious moment, that we need to atone for the kind of lifestyle we have, which is why it is, in my opinion, more important for them to reduce living standards in the West than it is to elevate living standards in the rest of the world. And this is really what I was trying to say in the pieces. We should not focus on how we could make life more miserable for us. We should try to focus on how we could make life better for, 2.4 billion in Africa, south of the Sahara. I mean, that's the true challenge, and that will not be feasible without energy. And I think this is a topic, and I'm glad that Spike gave me the opportunity to write about this. This needs to get more attention, because if we don't solve that problem, it's going to be two things. One of them is, if these regions remain as poor as they are, first of all, it's morally reprehensible, but of course then they will move. Of course it will lead to migration. And the other problem is, if we get poorer in Europe and other parts of the West, it will make it harder to absorb immigration. And even if we say, okay, let's do a kind of trade-off, let's make us worse off and them better off. In my example is always China. Countries that grow need quote-unquote richer countries to trade with. So the idea, let's make Europe poor and Africa is going to get rich, this is not how this works, right? Economics are not at least, geopolitics is different, but from a purely economic sense, it's never zero-sum. So if I'm getting better, right, then my neighbor's probably also going to get better because I buy stuff from them. I hire them to do things. And I think this is kind of the more, if you want, the more general picture that I was trying to describe.
And Ralph, do you think that the developing world, the global south, whatever you want to call it, are going to, in a sense, just bring a large dose of sanity to this discussion in the coming years? Because they've obviously been coming under a lot of pressure from various Western governments and NGOs to grow in a quote-unquote sustainable way, to embrace quote-unquote clean energy, to essentially just stunt their own industrial development, really. All of that stuff is more or less code for that. But at the same time, particularly in the geopolitical and economic context we find ourselves in, it seems like they're even less willing to put up with that. You're starting to see a lot more pushback from those countries in particular. They're just refusing to be kept poor, essentially. Do you think that they're going to be the force for kind of realism in this particular energy discussion?
I think so. And I could see it in the feedback I got from the piece. Right after the piece was written, I got a lot of positive feedback from India. I got a lot of positive feedback from Africa. So the regions I was talking about, or at least those who reached out to me, was generally the feedback was very positive because they know this as well. As we said before, right? Many of the things that come to us naturally are for them luxuries that they yet want to achieve. And more power to them. They are right to do so. And they also, I think, are getting upset. I recently, with a tweet, caught the eye of Mark Jacobson. I don't know if you or your viewers know him. He's at Stanford, and he basically makes this claim that you can power entire energy systems, entire grids, only with water, wind, and solar. And I said, well, I want to see a prototype. Like, show me that it works. And he says, well, there are countries who are almost there. And the countries he uses as an example is, for example, Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? It's true that they are, 99% wind, solar, water, but it's also true that only about 40 to 50% of them have access to electricity at all. So nobody in the Congo, nobody in Ethiopia thinks that their energy model should be the role model for the rest of the world. They think they need more of it. And I think they sense that if we say we want Europe to be more like the Congo and not Congo to be more like Europe, we probably put the cart before the horse.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, what do you think? Where are we at with net zero at the moment? Is it kind of colliding with reality, or do you think it's got a fair bit more to go in terms of Western governments?
Both. It's colliding with reality, but it's still got a long way to go because Western governments are so kind of deluded about it. My view about net zero has never changed, which is that it's a nice idea, not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones is that the developing world's not going to go along with it. You've just recently had President Xi saying that China will go towards net zero at its own pace. In other words, they're not going to do it. They've never had any intention of doing it, nor has India, nor has Brazil, nor has obviously Russia or most of Africa. Of course they're not going to do it. And in the Western countries, it's not actually possible either at the moment. Look, I'm all in favor of green energy. I really am. And I think actually a lot of it has progressed a lot faster than some people said it would do. And some of that, no doubt, is down to the political, the endless talk, about it, and not to mention all the various subsidies and so on. But as things stand, we simply cannot produce enough electricity to go to net zero. Just on private transport, we haven't got enough electricity. If we built lots and lots of nuclear power stations, it would be more feasible, but there doesn't seem to be any will to do that here or in many other countries. So, without some major technological revolutions or an almost unthinkable increase in the amount of nuclear power being used, it ain't going to happen. So I really feel that we need to adapt. People will have different views about how catastrophic things are going to get, and some people won't think it's going to be much of a problem at all. I don't have a view about that. I'm not a climate change denier, though, by any means. I think there will be calls to adapt. Where my neck of the woods down here on the Sussex coast, they've spent millions and millions of pounds lifting up flood defences and stuff for a river that's never burst its banks. Seems to me that they should be focusing these efforts on places that are routinely bursting their banks. York and the Somerset Levels and places are constantly flooding, and will continue to with or without climate change. So I think that's really where we need to be putting in the money, because the idea that the whole world's going to go to net zero when the world's population is growing so rapidly, apart from anything else, just the extra 3 billion people who we expect to see over the course of the next few decades is enough to prevent net zero ever happening. So we need to be a bit more grown up about this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I think this is all true, and kind of to put it a little bit on a broader footing. I mean, there is one story that I always love to tell because I think it also is very emblematic of the problems we have today and how they were treated in at different times. So, around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, there was pretty much, as we would say today, kind of scientific consensus that the world does not produce enough food, right? With the Industrial Revolution, populations were growing rapidly, and farm output, agricultural output could not keep pace. So this was kind of common knowledge at the time. If kind of agricultural output remains where it was at the time, we would have huge famine, huge starvation. But what happened was that there was kind of this race to who is the first to create synthetic ammonia and synthetic fertilizers. And there was no doubt in anybody's mind, right, that the kind of the scientific community will be able to do this. And they did it. The Germans, supposedly, which is true, were the first ones. But if you kind of look deeper into the entire story, it was kind of cooperation all around the globe. There were American scientists involved. There were British scientists involved. There was a French scientist involved. And all this happened in the 1910s, 1912s. And kind of in the midst of World War I, the Germans built their first ammonia factory. So there was this idea that if there's a problem, you look at the problem, you solve the problem. Nobody at the time would have ever thought about, well, we just have to reduce the number of people on the planet. And this is kind of what we do now, right? We say, well, even if there would be technical solutions, there are still too many people. We have to reduce the numbers of the people. So it's a little bit of a, it's not just an energy crisis in the sense of like energy is energy, oil, gas, and kinetic energy. I think there is a kind of an energy crisis of spirit in the sense that there is no longer the trust or the confidence that we can live up to the challenges, whether it be climate change or the energy transition, in any meaningful way. I think it has now descended almost in a desire for the apocalypse. My sense is very often, I might be a little bit hyperbolic here, that we are still living in the aftermath of World War I and World War II, in a sense that, Western civilization has to atone for the past. We've kind of, the sins have become so burdensome that there's a certain desire to finally come to the end of it all. Again, I'm exaggerating slightly, but I do mean it partly. Right? You see then that in the alarmism, right? There's this, we say, but nuclear, it's not going to be fast enough. Right? Nothing is going to be good enough. It needs to be connected somehow to suffering. It needs to be degrowth. It needs to be, from not eating meat, or I think something we're going to talk about later on, or no sugar or no coffee. It needs to be somehow connected to suffering. And for me, this sounds more like religious atonement than like, okay, there might be a problem. How can we mitigate the problem, adapt to its consequences, and basically just move on as we have in the past?
I think that's a really important point because it goes just beyond naysaying. Like you say, there's a kind of almost a desire for everything to go to hell in a handcart. And it does feel like there is that long-running just discomfort with industrial modern society that particularly the sort of intellectual elites have felt quite uncomfortable with for many, many decades. And this just feels like the latest expression of it in so many respects.
If I want to be extremely hyperbolic, and I know I say this deliberately to be provocative, I mean, there are some parallels, let's say, between the apocalyptic side of fascism and the apocalyptic side of the environmental movement. Again, I'm saying this very, very careful, but I think we should not, at least from a historical perspective, ignore these things. I mean, this idea that somehow human beings are a blight upon the planet and that nature is its purest when left untouched. This was something that was not so much in Italian, but this was very popular in German fascism. I mean, this is something that really permeates lots of their writings, and they never denied it. I mean, the idea, for example, in Germany of organic farming and these kind of things, this was very, very popular in the Third Reich. Again, I'm not saying that everybody who's for organic farming is, a crypto-fascist and a hidden Nazi, but this idea of that the end of the world can be avoided if we go back to kind of an idealized past, I think that is something that is present in both movements.
The connection between environmentalism and fascism historically is something that no one ever points out, but it is actually true. And even actually, one, not to get caught on this particular point, and I don't mean to say this just to bash environmentalists as if, you can smear them with this brush. There's enough thrown around of the fascist slur these days. But one thing that I always find quite striking is all these kind of white supremacist shooters, whether it's in New Zealand or in various parts of America in recent years, have been eco-fascists, self-avowed and so on, which is something that never actually gets talked about. Yeah, so, as you say, there's a long-running connection between those things. Chris, unless you've got anything on eco-fascism, shall we move on to Tony Blair?
Oh, yes, please.
You sound so excited. So this is the news that Tony Blair, his Global Institute for Change, they've had a big conference this week, putting out various different statements and so on. And he has come out in favour of more taxes on sugar, on salt, essentially getting behind Jamie Oliver's long-running campaign to sin tax our way out of obesity, as he would see it. It's not really much of a surprise, I suppose, insofar as Tony Blair was certainly in this country someone who took to the sort of nanny-state crusade quite happily. But Chris, what do you make of all of this?
Well, it's just all the centrist dads, isn't it? The Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair kind of is the centrist dad. He's the centrist dad, and his think tank. What's it called? The Global Institute.
Tony Blair Global Institute for Change, no less. So
yeah. It's not lacking in ambition, is it?
And his change on the global scale has been so positive as well so far. So
yes, indeed. I mean, they had this little conference. I'm not sure what it was specifically about. Maybe just global change. And there was Emily Maitlis there, and John Sopel, and Henry Dimbleby, and Jamie Oliver, and just all the usual people. And I was actually watching the Jamie Oliver interview with the news agents, which is Emily Maitlis and John Sopel. I mean, it's just such a establishment kind of thing, isn't it? It's as if people stuck in the noughties and just wish we could go back to the noughties when all we had to worry about was turkey Twizzlers. They asked him about turkey Twizzlers, actually. They asked him about turkey Twizzlers, did Emily Maitlis. And he was very defensive about it. He said he never actually banned turkey Twizzlers. He just got food standards that happened to mean that turkey Twizzlers was banned. He said that, and this doesn't make turkey Twizzlers sound great, I'll grant you, but he said that one of his main achievements was getting a guarantee that meat products served in schools had to be at least 65% meat, and turkey Twizzlers fell very, very far short of that.
I'll be amazed if they hit the double digits from memory, but yeah.
Yeah, it was about 19%. Mostly fat, which is, I guess, why they're so delicious and why so many people hate him for getting rid of them. But I think I probably said this before on the podcast. I don't believe that Jamie Oliver is as popular as people like Tony Blair and Emily Maitlis think. I don't think I know anyone who likes him. An entire generation hate him because of the turkey Twizzlers. My generation hated him before that for just being an annoying mockney git. I guess maybe old women might like him. I'm only guessing here, but like the kind of people like Alan Titchmarsh, maybe like Jamie Oliver, they think he's kind of a safe pair of hands, harmless, nice young man. I can only think that's his constituency, because other than that, it's a total mystery. And he just always gets these invites, doesn't he? He gets treated like royalty. I've never ever seen him up against anyone who disagrees with him. I've never seen him being challenged. Henry Dimbleby's come along as a sort of, poor man's Jamie Oliver doing the same kind of stuff. It's just it's the lack of imagination. We did the sugar levy, didn't actually do anything really, but let's tax salt and sugar in general. Yeah, is this the kind of global change we need right now? Making food more expensive? Maybe not. But they don't see the context because they still think it's 2005.
And it was interesting as well because the wording of the Institute's statement on this was so explicit as far as just the inability to compute the idea that this should be up to people to decide for themselves. I think they said that we've tried, quote, personal responsibility, and it's a failed approach. What do you do with something like that?
Yeah, they always say that. That just means it didn't get what they wanted. we tried. They say this about education. They said we tried education and it didn't work. Somebody said this quite explicitly, actually, on the King's Fund blog recently. Some new report funded by the King's Fund called, I think it's called a Health Covenant or something like that. It was absolute standard stuff. It was, again, the centrist dads. It was like Lord Bethel and, I can't remember who was there. But like it's a completely random collection of just middle-aged do-gooders. Lord Bethel used to run the Ministry of Sound and now seems to be almost like doing a penance for facilitating people having a good time at one point in his life by being a miserable killjoy. And he was exactly the same stuff in that. Let's tax sugar and salt, amazing, yeah. And this blog post said something to the effect of, all the evidence shows that if you give people information, they don't change their behaviour, so we know that doesn't work. It's like, well, hang on, if you've got people who are well informed and they behave in the same way as when they were badly informed, all it means is that they were doing what they wanted to do in the first place. If you give people education and information and evidence and they then go off and do something you don't like, that doesn't mean that those things have failed. it means that they've worked. It just means that your view of how they should live is not the same as theirs. It makes the case for nanny-state action weaker, actually, not stronger. If they could only see that, So yes, education doesn't work in the sense that people will suddenly not drink more than 14 units of alcohol if you tell them that's what the chief medical officer thinks you should drink. But maybe the chief medical officer is wrong, or maybe drinking at a very low level of risk is not actually people's priority. These guys just have so little understanding about what it is to be alive. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You could use phrases like consumer welfare and well-being and utility and stuff like that, but really it just comes down to not understanding what it's like to be alive. If you don't follow these people's advice, which is based on the underlying premise that the only thing that matters is being as healthy as possible and living for as long as possible, if people ignore that advice, then they are somehow wrong in a profound way and need coercion to lead them to the straight and narrow. I mean, why don't they just go away? Why do we have to? I understand there's a whole industry, for keeping this up, but why is it such a priority for Tony Blair? Why the newsagents? I mean, why are they on Newsnight all the time?
Why, Ralph?
We want them to go away, don't we? Go away in the name of God. Go.
Speaking as the sole member and president of the Ralph Schoellhammer Institute for Global Reactionaries, this it does bother me a little bit, because I agree with everything that was just said. But the only thing I would add, and I think that is a broader topic we're probably going to get back to, which is, on the one hand, right, you have governments be very much behind any kind of pop culture fad. Take for example, body positivity, right? This idea that, beauty is different, and no matter what your body shape or body form is, it doesn't matter. But then all of a sudden, the same government would like to come in and say you shouldn't eat as much sugar and as much salt, as much fatty acids or whatever, because it's unhealthy. So then what is it, right? You promote the kind of consequences of that lifestyle, and then you want to get more power to restrict it. And this is something I think we see in many, many areas, because it has become very difficult these days, I believe, for governments to speak the language of virtue. Right? This idea that taking care of your, since you said before, by the way, this is also something I have to admit that the fascists said. But of course, this idea that you have to take care of your body, right? This idea that your body is not entirely private, is they have a hard time kind of coming to grips with on this. They want simultaneously full autonomy over your body, but at the same time, then they want to kind of take it away from you. And I think that needs to be found a kind of a middle ground or a bridge. And I think it also explains what we see now. We have this weird situation now where you have the left pushing kind of for whether it's body positivity or, sex and gender changes. And then you have this kind of other movement on the right, which is kind of the Bronze Age pervert Andrew Tate approach, which I think is in its own way also bad. Because there is no more, this is why I always say I'm becoming more and more 19th century reactionary, where this idea of a common sense middle ground. You should, I completely agree with you, Grace, right? This idea, you should have the occasional enjoyment, right? You should have the occasional pastry and the occasional, even, God help us all, the occasional cigarette and the occasional drink. But of course, everything in moderation, right? This idea, as I felt, was kind of very commonsensical, even a couple of decades ago among our parents' generation, is now kind of replaced by weird extremes. You either have to be a bodybuilder or you have to be a 200-pound woman. And I think there should be, or identify as a 200-pound woman. And I think there should be somewhere a middle ground where everybody, what most people, I think, would be very comfortable.
And touching on some of the issues that you were talking about there is the other story that we're going to talk about today, which is something you picked out, Chris, reported, I think today, about the shock and horror which has met a particular program which has been rolled out to schools. So Mattel, the toy manufacturers, did a project with the University of Cardiff about using dolls to socialize children, to get them to empathize and to look after and so on. So as part of that, they gave out 150,000 primary school children Barbie dolls, essentially. And as a consequence of this, they've been accused of, at the lower end, stealth marketing, that they're only doing this because they're trying to shift more units, as it were. But some of the responses have been even more hysterical in both senses of the word to that. There was Philippa Perry, who's a psychotherapist, who said she was faintly repulsed by the program. There was another one here, Mark Pettigrew from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who called it deeply alarming. What do we make of this, Christopher?
I didn't see it coming, Tom. I have a pretty low opinion of the public health lobby in general, but I did not see them trying to snatch children's dolls out of the hands of school children. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting response. This is part of a BMJ investigation, British Medical Journal investigation. It has nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with health. The Mark Pettigrew you mentioned, he's from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It has nothing to do with hygiene or tropical medicine either. The best quote came from Pettigrew's colleague, who I think is called May van Schalkwijk. She said, commercial entities like Mattel are not experts in children's health or education. They are experts in selling products to maximize profits. The Mattel materials are heavily branded. Why should children be exposed to this type of stealth marketing? Right, well, not to get our teeth into there. Firstly, if they're heavily branded, how is it stealth marketing? If that's stealth marketing, then what is aggressive marketing or blatant marketing look like? Secondly, yes, it's true Mattel are not necessarily experts in children's health or education, but it's quite obvious that this woman is not an expert in business, or as far as I can tell, really in children's health or education. She has a master's in public health, and in the last few years, in her brief career in public health, I know her mainly from writing about gambling. She obviously hates big alcohol, Brexit, trade deals, tobacco, e-cigarettes. No, I'm not knocking it. I talk about a lot of stuff as well, But I, on the other hand, don't get BMJ investigations headlines, expert criticizes such and such, which is what she got just for moaning about this scheme, which no doubt is a marketing scheme. No doubt, Mattel do want kids to carry on buying Barbies, and they're probably losing income to apps and iPads and all this kind of stuff. And I dare say playing with a toy is better for a child's development than staring at a screen. I mean, that seems perfectly plausible to me. And if that's what the evidence shows, which is what they say it does, why not get these toys into school? These toys come with like a lesson plan and all stuff about disabilities and vulnerabilities and all the kind of stuff you'd expect in school these days. And the BMJ quotes this teacher. They only found one teacher to comment, but this teacher seemed absolutely delighted for it. They said they're in a socially deprived area, welcome these toys that many of our children don't get the opportunity to engage in speaking and listening activities about subjects such as these. So the teacher's happy. Mm-hmm. It's just a couple of extremist public health people who are quite openly in this instance just against capitalist enterprise, right? There's no public health aspect to this whatsoever, really.
Was there no bit of it that was trying to be about, I don't know, anti-Barbie gender stereotypes or something? Yeah. Was there some of that? Or?
She cited a study, this Van Schalkwijk. Mm-hmm. She cited one study that found that girls who played with Mrs. Potato Head tended to see a smaller difference in future job prospects between girls and boys than those who played with a Barbie. And there was a study that found that playing with Barbie was associated with a preference for a thin body, which, if anything, you would think public health people would approve of. I don't know. Maybe
another contradiction as well.
Yeah, maybe the people who play with Mrs. Potato Head have a preference for a potato head or a thick body. I don't know. But I mean, this is just, but on the other hand, there's this evidence showing it's good for kids' development. So, I mean, at the end of the day, who really cares what the social science says about this? Kids like dolls, kids like playing with toys, they're getting some free toys and a nice little lesson. Everyone's happy except for these fruitcakes. And to me, it shows that this isn't about health. It's just about complaining about corporations and marketing. And they can't stand this stuff, no matter what the issue is. It doesn't have to have anything to do with health, really.
Ralph?
I kind of swore an oath never say anything bad about Mattel, because with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, they gave me the greatest childhood experience a boy can ever dream of. So I'm very indebted to them from that perspective. But on the broader issue, what I find frustrating is I think Barbie came out in 1959. We have become such a uncreative or shallow culture in many ways, that if you look at all the pop culture things that we talk about, whether it's, I think Marvel is now doing the 50-second reboot of Spider-Man, then the big hit is Barbie, and based on a plastic figure from the 1950s. So she's a conservative model, because her heyday was in the 1960s. So technically every liberal or every left-leaning person would hate them. But we see it in the music, right? Which bands are still filling concert halls? It's the Rolling Stones and, all these men who are I think by now in their mid-70s or something. And this is something that really worries me, is there is nothing new coming. And I think this is also a little bit reflected in these debates. Kind of, we've become a culture that on the one hand likes to pride itself on its progressivism and, tearing down borders and tearing down walls. But is it really, or is it just a constant reheating and warming up of something that has been around? If we take Superman, for example, since the 1940s, I think the first enemy of Superman was Adolf Hitler. I mean, this is not really something particularly new. I mean, good for them if they make money, right? Good for capitalism. But I was always told that capitalism is, innovation and new stuff and all these kind of things. So far, I just see the same superheroes I've seen in my youth. And, I'm over 40, so that's quite a while.
Definitely. Let's reach into the postbag just for our final section, just to answer a couple of questions that have been sent in by our loyal listeners.
Postbag. It's bulging, eh?
Both of them, you won't be surprised to know, center around the sort of net zero question rather than the Barbie question. So we're going to make a bit of a handbrake.
Well, both questions are the two loyal listeners.
We've got two listeners, yeah.
Two listeners, and they always send in questions under different pseudonyms. It's very nice of them to do so. This one's from Jean Granville, who has tweeted us saying, a politician can never admit his policies have failed and were inconsidered in the first place. So how can they get out of net zero when it becomes unsustainable? What do you think, Ralph? Will that be part of the problem, is that it's not just one political party, it's all the political parties. It's particularly in Europe, that's definitely for true. It's the kind of whole of the establishment really are in favour of these policies. How do they, even if they wanted to, step back from some of these goals they've set themselves?
This is, I have to say, particularly to your listener, this is a fantastic question, because I think it very much goes to the heart of the matter, what's wrong in so much in Western politics. We have, without getting too far off topic, but we have kind of reached this idea at this point where there is this strong belief, particularly in part of the ruling class, right, that the state ultimately can solve every problem. The state will solve every problem, and then it was just a small step to the state can never be wrong. I think we saw this very, very clearly during COVID. Right? There was barely any, with a few exceptions. I think in Denmark there was an excuse by newspaper. Sweden did it slightly differently. But basically, nobody was there to say, listen, this is a new situation. We were not perfectly prepared for it. So there will be a lot of trial and error. Come with us along the way. We're going to try to be as honest, as transparent as possible, but mistakes will be made. They did exactly the opposite in many cases, right? The more, let's say, ambiguous things became, the more they doubled down on, no, we know exactly what we're doing. And so I'm glad what your listener is saying. This is going to be the same in net zero. Let me give you one quick example of where this will come to a heat. In November of this year, we have snap elections in the Netherlands. I believe these are going to be the first elections that are really going to pit the pro-net zero and the anti-net zero crowd against each other. Because you have with the BBB, the Farmer Citizens Movement, you have kind of political party that has been very critical, especially of environmental policies. And now Frans Timmermans, for those who don't know him, he was the EU climate commissioner and is the mastermind, depending how you want to look at it, behind most of the European Union's climate policies. He's now returning to his native country of the Netherlands and is running for the left-wing side. So you really have two blocks, a pro-environmental net zero block running against an anti-environmental net zero block. And we will see who comes out on top of this. But this could be the first referendum on net zero policies. But to answer your listener's question, it took the BBB, which was only founded in 2019, because none of, as you mentioned, Tom, right, none of the establishment parties or established parties was willing to go into that direction because they have committed to it in the past, and now it's very hard for them to get out of it.
And you've also effortlessly answered the second question that we had there, which is from Benny Beats, I'm sure that's his real name, who's talking about where there's going to be a tipping point. Chris, as Ralph was saying it's starting to feel like more of an electoral issue. We've just had a string of by-elections in the UK where the Tories managed to cling on to one solely on the basis of the fact that the issue at play there was obviously on the question of the ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone, which is more clean air than it is net zero, but nevertheless shows that voters aren't happy with it. Chris, do you think that there's going to be a sort of a clear electoral impact in the UK to some of these policies anytime soon?
Yeah, well, I think with the ULEZ thing, there has been. And I think Labour will be thinking very carefully about that coming up to the election, what they're going to say in outer London. Obviously, in Holland, we've seen quite dramatic effects from the assault on farming's been done in the name of net zero. I don't think the politicians are going to have to do like an obvious U-turn. I think the public are going to pressure them into going that direction. Keir Starmer, coming out saying he hates tree huggers was going in that direction.
So convincing that.
The thing is, look, at the moment people are going, well, the economy's screwed, inflation's so high, we can't, it's not a priority. The reality is there's always going to be a crisis that's bigger than this long-term ambition. Same with Ukraine, same as COVID. I mean, all these things have been kind of, we can't really focus on this now. There'll never be a good time to do it. They just won't. I mean, there will be a certain amount of, as we've already experienced, there'll be a certain amount of lower growth because we're spending so much money trying to accomplish it. And I dare say we will spend a lot more money before the tipping point comes. But I don't think it'd be an obvious tipping point when it comes. It would just be a bit like, well, let's put it this way. The government, no one probably remembers this, the government has a target to halve child obesity by 2030. It's never actually going to say we changed our mind about this. It's just going to be forgotten about. Same probably with the smoke-free by 2030 and God knows what other targets being made along the way. It's still 27 years off. Things will become, let's say, more nuanced in those 27 years, I think.
Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we should not underestimate, and I think that also pertains very much to this question, it's of course not just the leading politicians and the governments themselves who have control over this. Very often these things are funneled through vast bureaucracies. And of course, in the past, a good example in the United States is, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, which has become in the last decades basically an anti-nuclear regulatory agency. And whatever the government wants to do, they can block many, many things. We see the same you have in the U.S. courts, right? Many of the judges there have a significant, let's say, anti-fossil fuels bent. So in West Virginia, there is a pipeline that is kind of supported by all parties, including Joe Biden at this point. But the courts, this is I think now the fourth injunction, and I think we're going to see a lot of this also in Europe and in other areas. Even if politicians, I completely agree with Chris, right? If they kind of see where their bread is buttered, and if they see that the electorate is shifting their position, they want to shift it too. But the quote unquote, unnamed bureaucrat in a windowless office, whether it be in Brussels, London, or Berlin, it's going to be much harder to see them make the shift. And they kind of will just, in many ways, stick to what they have done in the past. And a lot of obstruction will come not from the top, but will come kind of from the area between the top politicians and the realm where it is supposed to be executed. The kind of nameless bureaucratic agencies are, without calling them kind of, polarizingly the deep state, because I don't think that's what it is. It's just a classical problem of you have people who also pursue their own goals, and many of them who are in charge of these institutions will not be easily swayed just because, for example, a BBB comes to power in the Netherlands or a Meloni comes to power in Italy.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. That's all we've got. Chris, Ralph, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.